and welcome to Humans of History. On this channel we break down the personalities of historic figures. So we look at their influences, their quirks, their habits, foibles. We try to look beyond their famous achievements or moments and understand the human faces behind the mask. Today we're profiling Catherine the Great. She was the enlightened despot of Russia, the princess turned benevolent tyrant, the warrior Tsarina, and the passionate paramour. She's remembered for having scores of lovers, but she also expanded Russia way beyond her borders and fostered a great cultural and artistic flourishing in Russia that turned a kingdom, once considered a barbarian state, into a respectable European power. But who really was she? How did her family, her contemporaries, her courtiers view her? What would you have thought of her? In case you don't know anything about Catherine the Great, here is a flash biography that we're going to try to do in 3 minutes. Hit that clock. Catherine the Great was born as Sophie in the small town of Stettin in 1729. At the time it was part of Prussia, now it's in modern-day Poland. Yes, the great Russian Empress didn't have a single drop of Russian blood running through her veins. So, Sophie's family. You know what, let's just call her Catherine because that's the name we know her by. Catherine was part of the petty Prussian nobility. They were fairly well connected. Less through her father, who was an obscure Brandenburg prince in the Ascani dynasty, and more through her mother, Joanna, who was a descendant of the Holstein Gottorp dynasty. Joanna's brother, Adolf Frederick, actually became King of Sweden in 1751. Because this was the 18th century and marriage alliances were one of the most idiot-proof ways to advance your family's power and wealth, Catherine was essentially groomed from her early childhood to marry, get pregnant, and hopefully become rich someday. But nobody would have imagined a political future for her in Russia, let alone as Empress. Her cretin of a cousin, Peter III, was handpicked by the then Empress of Russia, Elizabeth, to become her successor. Catherine was to become his lucky bride. So in 1744, she made the great trip from Prussia to Russia with her mother, and within practically days of arrival, realized that the Russian court was essentially a snake pit of scheming nobles jostling for power and festering in wasteful extravagance. Catherine spent the next 18 years in this foreign hell of gossip and intrigue at St. Petersburg, barely tolerating her abusive fool of a husband, devoting herself to reading, learning the Russian language and Eastern Orthodoxy, while having a few affairs on the side. These, it's widely believed, produced all of Catherine's children. Peter was, after all, completely uninterested in Catherine, and even if he was either too drunk or occupied with his toy soldiers to produce an heir. In 1762, Catherine pulled off what many in the Russian court were hopeful for: the deposition from the Russian throne of her husband Peter, who was notoriously anti-Russian, and if he had had his way, would have gifted the entire Russian Empire to his idol, Frederick the Great of Prussia, on a silver platter. With Catherine's seizure of the throne, Russia entered what is now remembered as a golden age, the age of Catherine the Great. Catherine was a great admirer of Peter the Great, who had essentially brought Russia onto the European political chessboard. Her rule is seen as one which expanded his legacy. One historian has called her not a planter who lays the conditions for the success of future crops, but a harvester who prevents the crop from spoiling and using the crops to the best advantage. This meant territorial expansion, gaining swathes of land in western, southern and eastern Russia through diplomacy and war. It also meant establishing administrative structures on Western European models, rationalizing the bureaucracy, and establishing new settlements. Catherine is considered as one of the enlightened despots, advocating for the ideals of the French Enlightenment and applying them in her policies. In 1767, she published the Nakaz, or the Instruction, which outlined her legal vision for the future of Russia. It was basically a shameless plagiarism of Montesquieu's L'Esprit des Lois, and had she been a student, she probably would have got a 0. But as a world ruler, her noble ideas of equality and freedom scored her points with thinkers and rulers all over Europe. She brokered all sorts of cultural exchanges between Western Europe and Russia, sponsoring the arts, championing free education, and is seen as the empress who brought Russia out of the Dark Ages and into European civilization. Her 34-year rule ended in 1796 when she died of a stroke at the age of 67. She survived the French Revolution and was succeeded by her son Paul I. Catherine, or Sophie, was born into the lower nobility. She was raised as a country girl. Her family's wealth was moderate and her court was miniature compared to most of her time. She recounts being embarrassed whenever aristocrats came to visit her family. But her mother's Holstein connections meant Catherine spent many months of her childhood at some of the finest German courts, playing with future rulers and dining with the cream of the German aristocracy. At 10 years old, she even met her future husband Peter, whom she almost immediately disliked, with his pale and sickly complexion and fondness for the bottle when he was just 11 years old. That's alcohol, not milk, by the way. Though she was constantly in the public gaze, she had very few friends. One of the rare distractions from her studies and life of relative monotony was the company of an old aunt. Catherine's mother, Joanna, essentially abused her. She neglected Catherine from the moment she was born. She'd shame her for her looks, scold her for her clumsiness, and constantly tell her that she was worthless. She was prone to severe mood swings and likely projected her frustrations onto her perfectly innocent daughter. One of these frustrations was very likely the fact that Joanna had wanted a boy. Catherine's birth also involved terrible complications, which almost cost Joanna her life. It's completely plausible that Joanna resented her daughter for not being worth the near-death experience. If Catherine was of any use to her mother, it was to marry her off to a prince and advance the family's own interests. So if there was anything Joanna had a vested interest in, it was Catherine's education and preparation for a life at court. She made sure Catherine was kept busy with studies, partly to prepare her for the life of a princess, partly to keep her occupied and out of her sight. She was taught French, the lingua franca at the time, as well as her native German, music, history, and needlework. Her teachers were diametrical opposites. One was a Lutheran pastor called Wagner, whose strictness and resistance to Catherine's curious challenges made her dislike him. In her memoirs, she remembered him as a boring pedant. Her other mentor was a French Calvinist lady called Elizabeth Gardel, whose intelligence, liveliness, and interdisciplinary knowledge are believed to have had a long-lasting impact on Catherine's intellectual growth. When her mother did intervene in her education, it was to instill courtly etiquette and manners, which would contribute to Catherine's famous later charm. Catherine weathered her mother's temperament, and throughout her childhood really remained quite obedient. No doubt she developed quite a thick skin from her mother's neglect and abuse, and this temperament would help shield her later in life, perhaps not always healthily, from any unpleasantness she had to deal with. On the surface, she was a dutiful daughter who respected tradition and authority. When she arrived in Russia at age 14, destined to be the fiancée of the Grand Duke Peter, she came with a certain set of goals. These included to please Peter to the greatest possible degree, and this inevitably meant riding out his insufferable childishness and coarse ways. These would range from staging a military execution of a rat who had apparently killed 2 of his toy soldiers to shamelessly revealing to Catherine his romantic interest in other women. Catherine also made it a point to obey Queen Elizabeth, the Russian Empress. Despite her mercurial temper, Catherine apparently admired her greatly, praising her beauty and grace in her memoirs. Judging how vivid Catherine's impressions were of Elizabeth as a child when she wrote about her from the perspective of an adult, lengthy. It wouldn't be a stretch to say the Empress probably had quite an impact on her. Another one of her main goals was to integrate herself to Russian customs and culture. Though her father had raised her quite strictly as a Lutheran, she enthusiastically converted to East Christian Orthodoxy in June 1744. This was the moment she apparently changed her name from Sophie to Catherine, in honor of Empress Elizabeth's late mother. With the goal to learn Russian, she also surrounded herself with native chambermaids, and generally assimilated much more easily into the Russian court than her German fiancé had, who hated everything Russian. Though the Empress grew increasingly frustrated with Catherine's inability to produce an heir with Peter, Catherine ultimately became the apple of her eye, the Empress's darling. She won her heart through innocent flattery and sweetness, but also through her very conscious zeal in the practice of Russian Orthodoxy. In church services, she would often pray so devoutly that her head would often touch the floor. It's actually incredible how lightly she got off on several occasions. She accumulated massive debt for one. When she arrived in Russia, a friend told her that it was customary in the Russian court to spend lavishly on gifts. Catherine did a little bit too much of this, apparently. This was no doubt a tactic she fully embraced to make herself likable in the materialistic foreign court. This, however, turned out only to be a mild blemish in her relationship with the Empress. On one occasion, Catherine was caught red-handed as part of a Prussian-backed intrigue designed to undermine Austro-Russian relations. After only 2 potentially life-changing meetings with the Empress, Catherine came out unscathed. In fact, in the second, she had thrown herself at the Empress's feet, begging her for forgiveness and even demanding that she be exiled. Within a matter of minutes, the Empress was in tears and was tenderly kissing her beloved little Catherine as if she was wholly undeserving of such insulting suspicion. Yes, Catherine was well on her way at mastering the art of pulling people's heartstrings. While at this stage it might have been done more innocently, it was later adopted in her style of rule. Catherine also managed to escape the humiliating consequences of her mother's idiotic intrigues against the Russian crown at the request of Frederick the Great. Her mother was sent home, but Catherine, of course, stayed on. She was, after all, there to produce an heir, and the sweet, innocent princess was far too popular with the Empress and the court to be sent home. And as we know, she did so much more than stay on. The provincial German princess, who even to her chambermaids seemed rather unremarkable, went on to overcome all of the obstacles thrown her way. She married the Grand Duke, kicked him off the throne within a few months of Elizabeth's death, and then ruled over Russia for 34 years. And this was despite the fact that even in her closest circles, there were elements who strongly held that she was the illegitimate monarch. So there was certainly more going on than her just laying low and playing the role of obedient princess. In 1762, after 18 miserable years during which she rode out family deaths, court intrigues, the neglect and even abuse of her husband, Catherine seized the throne by force. Catherine herself wrote, quote, "I do not know how great the lust for power is in other rulers. In me, it is not great." On the other hand, she once boasted to the French ambassador that her sights had been set on the throne from the moment she arrived in Russia in 1744. In her memoirs, she also claimed that it was the prospect of the crown, one which she said to have dreamt of since childhood, that sustained her during those 18 years of isolation and neglect. Well, with a lot of situations, if you look at the outcome, you can usually work backwards and infer the motives. The impression one gets is that Catherine was set on taking the throne at one point or another, and that she was driven by power. It might not have corrupted her because she had the common sense and reason, as she would have boasted, not to let that happen. But let's look at the facts. Unlike Peter, who simply did not play the game of the Russian court, Catherine did. She understood that gifts and favors were part of the courtly culture and crucial to securing the loyalties of people who might be of later use to her. She had channels of income both locally and from abroad, particularly from the British ambassador, which she used very strategically to build a following. Of course, she used her wit and womanly charms as well. She charmed and eventually became lovers with Count Grigory Orlov, a Russian officer who was instrumental in the coup which toppled Peter. It's also believed he personally executed Peter just 8 days later. And it's not the case that Catherine had her followers orchestrate the coup while she took the back seat. For the weeks before the coup, she steered the ship, brokering between the various military bodies and making the orders. So we can say, with some relative confidence, that during her years of loneliness at the Russian court, Catherine was biding her time, and with tremendous cunning, an extremely cool head, and seemingly great hidden ambition, this would pay off. It must be said, though, that Catherine was often more reactive than active. Though she surrounded herself with people who supported the coup, she might not have got the ball rolling. The trigger for the coup was at a dinner one night in April 1762. Peter raised a toast, and though everybody stood up, Catherine remained seated. The infuriated host sent an officer to Catherine to ask why she hadn't stood up, to which she argued that she needn't to, as she was royalty. The message was then sent back to Peter, who ordered the middleman to tell her that she was a fool. But as if he was worried the messenger would soften the message, he actually stood up and yelled, "Fool!" This was in front of 400 people. With all eyes watching, Catherine just burst into tears. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is said to have been the incident which led her followers to press for action. A moment when public opinion was also so against Peter that it was then or never. Once in power, Catherine was extremely diligent in crafting her image. She'd usurped the rights of Peter after all, and there was concern that her son Paul might not even have been Peter's son, but rather that of Catherine's first lover, Sergei Saltykov. She therefore went to great lengths to ban any accounts of the coup and to censor critical domestic and foreign work. Her memoirs go into exhaustive accounts of how juvenile, cruel and detestable Peter was, with such virulence that many scholars have called it Catherine's attempts to justify the coup and subsequent death of her husband. Within the first few weeks of her rule, she passed several edicts in which she repeatedly claimed the takeover was a response to the will of the people. A complete fabrication, but which, if repeated enough, could easily be mistaken for truth. She was constantly preoccupied with how people perceived her. Propagandist image creating obviously played a part in this. From day one of her rule, she presented herself as a sort of warrior queen. She declared herself colonel of the Preobrazhensky Guards, a rank which Peter the Great held, and on the day of the coup, rode a brilliant white stallion, saber in hand. With great ceremonies, she passed by each of the regiments of the Imperial Guard before formally being acclaimed empress. She spent lavishly on the imperial court to dazzle foreign rulers and diplomats whenever they visited St. Petersburg. For Catherine, the grandeur of a country was determined by the grandeur of its court. And even if this wasn't the case, at least the impression of it was what mattered most. Her later correspondences with the leading French philosophers of the time were enthusiastically publicized, and therefore often choreographed. By association with philosophers, she could craft her image on the European stage as an enlightened ruler, upholding republican values of equality and the rights of men. And in her exchanges, when it came to embellishing her achievements or the status of Russia, a bit of hearty was not an issue for Catherine. She once assured Voltaire that, quote, "There is not a peasant in Russia who could not eat a chicken if it suited him, and that some could have turkey if they wanted." Just for the record, Turkey was enough of a rarity for the Western European elite at that time, let alone for the miserable Russian serfs who struggled enough as it was to buy bread. In foreign policy, she was as opportunistic as she had been with Peter. Most of Catherine's territorial gains were previously in the Ottoman Empire, Poland, and Sweden. These were all basically satellite states of the French, and were all seized at the time of declining French power. But Catherine is less known for that part of her personality. She's remembered for her style, her wit, her grace, really for being quite a catch. There was one thing Catherine did not require much premeditation for, and that was charming people. She described it best in her memoirs. Quote, "My disposition was naturally so accommodating that no one was ever with me a quarter of an hour without feeling comfortably into conversation, chatting with me as if they had known me for a long time." And this was hardly an exaggeration. Though she was not particularly beautiful, her cheeriness, her informal sense of humor, and ease of conversation could really make pretty much anybody feel comfortable around her. Even the dry English doctor who came to vaccinate the imperial family against smallpox in 1768 said this: "She has much grace and grandeur, so that even if one could forget her high rank, one would admit her to be one of the most pleasing members of her sex. To her natural charms, one must add the greatest politeness, sweetness, and good humor, and with all such reasonableness that it is manifest at every step, so that one cannot but be amazed at it." Her charms were so magnetic that a Polish prince, after meeting Catherine, wrote, quote, "None of her movements were quick. All in her was grave and noble, but she was like a mountain stream, which carries everything with it in its irresistible current." How poetic. Catherine, of course, was well aware of her charms, and having been in the public eye all her life, likely thrived off of any attention. Even for the simplest entrances and exits, Catherine made sure there was formidable ceremony and pomp so that she could make the greatest impression on anybody present. In part for political reasons, in part because she lapped up the attention. Joseph II, Habsburg Emperor, did some justice to Catherine's personality when, after his visit in 1787, he remarked, quote, "Fundamentally, the Empress likes to have fun." Catherine loved to dance. In February 1778, she scheduled 11 masquerades in the span of 2 weeks, on top of the dinners and banquets which she attended. She felt strongly that court glamour reflected the wealth of a country. 12% of the state's annual expenditure was therefore spent on the maintenance of the court, and Catherine certainly knew how to keep her courtiers happy. But although her rule was one laced with lavish balls and great ceremonies, attended by the cream of the European elite, she actually didn't enjoy formal occasions. She handled diplomacy with ease, but she despised the rigidity of it all. Visitors were shocked to find Catherine playing cards not only with statesmen and dignitaries, but with her sentries as well. If you had entered her royal apartment, known as the Hermitage, you could expect to have been greeted by her pet monkey or woofed at by a lapdog, a breed which, by the way, Catherine made popular in 18th century and 19th century Russia, as well as a mechanical table which, by the tug of a string, could send plates down or up through a lift device. This was a great amusement for her and her chambermaids. Hanging outside her apartment was also a list of, quote, rules for the behaviour of all entering these doors. They basically encapsulate Catherine's expectations of civility and humbleness, and her efforts to create a relaxed atmosphere for her guests. Among these are rules to, quote, leave all ranks behind, likewise hats and particularly swords, be seated, stand, walk as you see fit regardless of others, and others should join in any innocent fun that someone thinks up. Of course, you can't discuss Catherine's lust for life without discussing her lust for men. Catherine had at least 21 lovers in the course of 44 years. And no, we shouldn't give her too much stick for it. Even to her contemporary male rulers, let alone most in history, this was not excessive. But for a female head of state at the time, she was the butt of all sorts of rumours and jokes, not least from British propagandists whose bawdiness and general lack of taste have quite a lot in common with today's tabloids. The most famous rumour was that she pleasured herself with a horse, as no human could mount her and satiate her endless sexual appetite quite like a stallion. This was also rumoured to be the cause of her death, a myth which survived well into the 19th century, by the way. This is clearly nonsense, but it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say Catherine was passionate by nature. In her youth, the British envoy, who had known her since she was a girl, compared the look in her eyes to that of a small wild animal. Quote, so piercing and full of desire that it was difficult to endure. Catherine liked men, and they liked her. Although it would be wrong to say that all of her lovers were mere satisfiers of lust. Some, particularly in her later years, did fill that role. Between 1776 and 1789, she changed lovers practically every year. However, her youthful love for Stanislaw Poniatowski, future King of Poland, was one of real passion. Grigory Orlov's unfaithfulness after 11 years as Catherine's lover left her distraught, and she admitted she would have carried on loving him had it not been for his betrayal. After the death of Alexander Lanskoy, one of her later lovers, she was a grieving wreck. She didn't sleep or eat for days, and she retreated into isolation. And let's not even begin to talk about Grigory Potemkin, her lover and essentially her co-Tsar for years, who died, and many say she never truly recovered from. Yes, she opened her heart to many, but in doing so, she allowed many to break it. These were never difficult for her to overcome, but in her darkest hours, she found solace in a world which she had forged for herself since she was a little girl. A world of reflection, of colour, of vibrance and language, a retreat and playground for an active mind. Catherine was something of an intellectual, or at least she liked to consider herself one. She was a prolific writer and wrote extensively from the age of 14 until her death at age 67. Around 700 pages make up her autobiographical writings alone. She also wrote on politics, Russian history, philosophy, education, economics and linguistics. Her eclecticism was reflected in her library. She boasted some 38,000 books, 4 rooms full of books and prints. Her miserable years as fiancée and wife to Peter III were largely spent reading classical and contemporary works in philosophy and political theory. She bought whole collections from Europe. This was in part for her own reading and research. Though she was modest about her writings, calling them, quote, trifles and, quote, rather mediocre, her works, particularly her memoirs, show a meticulous mind that researched, wrote, revised, rewrote, and constantly edited. Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws in particular was akin to her Bible. She also constantly consulted L'Encyclopédie by Diderot and D'Alembert, and she devoured anything published by Voltaire, who she considered as her, quote, spiritual father. Catherine was well known for her highly publicized correspondences with the leading philosophers of the era. These included Voltaire, whom she basically worshipped. He in turn, it said, was completely infatuated with her, even though they never actually met. Their letters were published and disseminated, discussed and debated across Europe's intellectual circles. These sorts of correspondences had tremendous benefits for all parties. Catherine could flatter her vanity by association with the great minds of the era, revealing to the world how enlightened she and her Russia were, and receiving great praise for it. The philosophers became something like groupies, who supported her in all of her undertakings. Catherine was also clever in milking as much knowledge and advice from them as possible to inform her policies. Though she wasn't really on the same level in terms of originality or real depth of thought, her curiosity, practicality, and resourcefulness are definitely commendable. She was a statesman after all, which she was happy to remind her pen pal Diderot when she snubbed him, saying, "Monsieur Diderot, you work only on paper, which tolerates everything. It is smooth, supple, and offers no resistance. Whereas I, a poor empress, work on human skin, which is much more irritable and ticklish." The philosophers massively benefited from the correspondence as well. They could rejoice in the international publicity, receive patronage, and see their theories and ideas disseminate into politics. Diderot, for one, got a great deal. He became the official librarian of his own collection in St. Petersburg, which Catherine had bought from him, and he was paid a salary of 50 years. Besides Catherine's letters, she wrote more than a dozen plays and operas, and the very first Russian children's literature. Catherine had fallen in love with Russia, its customs, its history, its language, and this shone in her academic projects. During her reign, she spent a total of 42 months traveling through the vast Russian Empire. In 1768, she ordered the Academy of Sciences to make expeditions, reports, illustrations, and maps in a survey of Russia. This was apparently ordered after a meeting when her advisors were at a loss to tell the Empress the location of a town they were discussing. And when the survey was completed and it was discovered just how many languages there were in Russia, Catherine organized a research team to create a comparative dictionary of all the languages not only in Russia but in the entire world, which she later published. Russian peasants and customs featured prominently in her plays and operas, while she devoted herself to writing exhaustive works on Russian history. That said, 4/5 of these were apparently paraphrased to the point where even the factual mistakes from the originals were transcribed. She adored the Russian language. She usually wrote in Russian when her writings were not designed to be read by an international audience. If they were, she wrote in French. She could read Latin and some limited English, although spoke no more than enough to get by with her English gardeners. She rarely wrote or even spoke her native German, a language she claims she brutalized. But then again, her Russian was pretty awful. She was basically illiterate, misspelling simple words. She never properly learnt grammar or the declension of nouns. Her editors were often dumbstruck at the amount of mistakes her works had. However, being the talker she was, her Russian speech was apparently delightful. She'd mainly learnt Russian with her chambermaids and later an eclectic range of figures of all ranks and vocations. As a result, she had a really colourful arsenal of Russian proverbs, colloquialism, idioms and local words, which she incorporated in her writings as well. That said, she had a thick German accent, which apparently only worsened with age. Which brings us to the big question: were her writings any good? Well, the historians' consensus isn't great. She certainly displayed no shame in massively plagiarizing major works, something she usually just laughed off. Generally, historians agree that her writings were, well, spectacularly mediocre and riddled with platitudes passed off as loose dictums. The English translator of Catherine's polemical work Antidote was stunned at how bad it was. So the will was there, but not necessarily the talent. And had the works not been authored by the Empress of Russia, it's probably safe to say nobody would be talking about them now. But the quality doesn't really matter much. A ruler with as much intellectual openness as Catherine is definitely something worth applauding. She not only greatly sponsored the arts, but she actively contributed to them. With her own letters and works, as well as the flourishing Russian arts which she actively sponsored, she showcased Russian civilization to Europe. At least in appearances, she dragged it out of its semi-barbaric state and meanwhile secured a fan base among the enlightened circles of 18th century Europe. As some of her contemporaries wrote, while Peter the Great created Russia's body, Catherine endowed it with a soul. Perhaps more personally, her writings helped her to understand herself as a ruler, but also as a woman, and she kept her mind active and happy, writing on the topics that fed, it must be said, her natural intellect. Historians have long debated over that popular formula, enlightened despot, to describe Catherine's rule, as well as that of other contemporaries like Frederick the Great and Joseph II. In Catherine's case, policies aside, her personality made her somewhat of a blend of both. Of course she was enlightened. She was tremendously well-read and a progressive thinker. Describing herself as a Republican soul and a freedom lover, she pushed for the liberal ideas in circulation and wherever she could, attempted to use them in her policies. She abolished torture and outlawed corporal punishment, things which were practically inconceivable in 18th century Europe, let alone in Russia. She was also dedicated to education. Her reign oversaw the opening of 3,000 schools, offering free schooling to all members of the population, girls and boys alike. This was practically unheard of for the time. Though not an egalitarian in the social sense, she truly cared about the plight of the peasants. The thing was, her illegitimate rule depended on the loyalty of the nobility to keep her in power. The result was she actually ended up expanding serfdom and protecting the interests of the serf-owning nobility. You could call this sacrificing your ideals for the sake of power, but if you look at the fates of the other Russian rulers who were deposed, it's hard to blame Catherine for wanting to keep her life, even if this obviously had implications on millions more. But then again, you'd be mistaken if you were to say Catherine resorted to tyranny and autocratic policy out of necessity. Though she claimed to despise despotism, often condemning the tyrants of ancient Rome, the circumstance of her rule combined with her personality meant she often displayed autocratic leanings. First, she was not one to tolerate criticism. Catherine's confidence was basically out of whack. I mean, it must have been for her to delve into as many genres and disciplines as she did, plagiarize as many works as she did, and associate herself as she did with the luminaries of her time. There was a certain untouchability to her character, and this fed into her politics. Historian Mark Raef discussed what he termed as Catherine's, quote, egotistical optimism. She convinced herself, because of her enlightened views, international popularity and style of government, that nothing but good could flow from her. Even in the most challenging moments of her rule, she would pretend that everything was just fine through the rosy lenses of that optimism. It's a bit like Trump in a way. Pugachev's rebellion, the Cossack revolt of 1773 to 75, that actually came close to toppling her reign, she initially saw as one big joke. The bounty on Pugachev's head was only 500 rubles when the insurrection broke out. The following year it was 28,000. She rarely succumbed to bouts of anxiety, depression, or suffered under the weight of pressure. Without delving into psychohistory too much, she might have developed some sort of shell, some sort of coping mechanism in her troublesome years of neglect at the Russian court, or during her childhood, who knows. When faced with complex problems that even her most able advisors were at pains to solve, she would provide quite simplistic solutions and convince herself that the matter was resolved. If her advisors complained, she wouldn't hear any of it. You wouldn't be far wrong to say that Catherine often regarded herself of higher intellect than her advisors. or at least felt she could often claim the moral high ground with a liberal agenda. If anyone dared to criticize her rule openly, she would call them shallow or unworthy of attention. When a French writer said Catherine hadn't actually achieved much during her reign, she called him mediocre. When a group of French economists sent her a robust critique of her royal manifesto, the Nakaz, she lambasted them as dissident fools. Any criticism of Russia in the time of Catherine was a direct criticism of Catherine. One of her courtiers and even protégés, a man called Alexander Radishev, wrote a 1790 book entitled Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow, in which he exposed and condemned the horrors of Russian serfdom and the country's socio-economic trouble. In what's regarded as one of the great low points of Catherine's regime, Radishev was arrested, tried, and later banished to Siberia. He was accused of sedition. Catherine termed it the, quote, French poison, and for inciting rebellion. As if the serfs could even read a book. Anything that reeked of sedition was suppressed. Catherine banned or burned books she disliked. She despised and censured Rousseau, for example, since his democratic and egalitarian views were politically dangerous. In the final 7 years of her rule, Catherine watched the events of the French Revolution unfold before her. She was absolutely terrified of it. It's one of the great ironies of Catherine's regime that she encouraged her countrymen and protégés to embrace the ideas of the Enlightenment, critical thought being the main one. But when her disciples applied these and questioned aspects of her rule, she succumbed to despotism and completely unenlightened reactionism. For Catherine, the model national trait for Russians was obedience, not self-cultivation or political awareness. The degree of her enlightenment was therefore limited and curtailed when it inconvenienced her. Her views on absolutism are pretty transparent when she said this, quote, "What can oppose the boundless power of the absolute monarch who governs a warring people?" The possibility of people living under a system which was not her own was intolerable to Catherine. She took her role as reformer extremely personally, and any challenge was seditious. She didn't often question the effectiveness of her measures. She prided herself on her efficiency, her organization, and her systematic rule of governance. She didn't often question the effectiveness of her measures. She prided herself on her efficiency, her organization, and her systematic style of governance, expecting rapid results with everybody running around like clockwork. If errors occurred or things didn't go according to plan, she was never at fault. Her ministers were. And if anybody criticized her achievements, they were usually snubbed. It's these megalomaniac tendencies that led the Prussian King Frederick the Great to comment, quote, "The Empress of Russia is very proud, very ambitious, and very vain." It's safe to say that Catherine had quite a rich, complex, and really quite a remarkable personality. She navigated and overcame the neglect of her mother, the abuse and humiliation from Peter, and the snake pit of the Russian court. With tremendous force of character, opportunism, and great patience, she struck when the iron was hot and secured her rule using the nobility to her advantage, and though illegitimate, staying in power by playing her cards right most of the time. Through her strategic self-promotion, she was lauded across Europe as an enlightened ruler. Through her cultural and intellectual patronage, she did wonders to perceptions of Russia on the world stage, with genuine desires for reform and genuine optimism in the ideas of the French Enlightenment. Though her pitfalls have been made clear, Catherine is definitely a figure worth celebrating, and dare I say, potentially worth the title of Catherine the Great. For those of you who have watched this far, thank you so much. Really appreciate your support. I hope you enjoyed this. Feel free to like, subscribe, you know the drill, and look forward to seeing you soon on Humans of History. Thank you so much.